Ozempic has been the highest earning prescription drug in the country for the last 4 years. With over 1 million Canadians taking these drugs, the Globe wanted to explore what it's changing, from business to science to how it's reshaping our culture and our bodies.
Ozempic and all the similar drugs like it, like Wegovy, are really blockbuster drugs. Like, there have not been a drug like this in a generation.
Often a patient will come and they'll start off, I ask them why they're here, and they'll say, I've tried so hard. And they start crying.
It's the best feeling, honestly. Like, I look in the mirror and I'm like, oh yeah, her.
Not everybody considers obesity to be a chronic disease, but most major medical organizations do.
I think that there's understandable lack of trust. Like, can I still work on body acceptance?
Side effects: nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, constipation, slowing of gut motility.
For the next 3 Mondays, our special projects producer, Kasia Mihailovich, is going to lead us through it all. And Kasia is here to give us an overview. Kasia, thanks so much for joining me in studio.
Thanks for having me, Cheryl. I can't wait to tell everyone about glucagon-like peptide-1 receptor agonists.
Okay, so that's probably a very good place to start because there's a lot of terminology to learn when it comes to these drugs. So what are you talking about?
So that's the full name of GLP-1s, the class of drugs that now include Ozempic and Wegovy and Mounjaro and Zepbound, and there's even more, but those are the big ones.
Okay, and just so we're clear, these are the drugs that treat diabetes and also make you lose weight. How exactly do they work?
On a very basic level, GLP-1 medications mimic a naturally occurring hormone called GLP-1. That's what manages partly our blood sugar and tells us when we're full from eating. But researchers are actually still trying to figure out all of the illnesses that GLP-1s can treat and how exactly it works in the human body.
And you spoke to a lot of people over this 3-part series. So can you give us a brief overview of what we're going to hear?
Well, you're going to hear from our colleagues, people like health reporter Kelly Grant and Business of Health reporter Chris Hannay. You'll hear from some of the people using these drugs and from leading doctors and scientists, including one man who's been researching GLP-1s since long before Ozempic came around, and who happens to have a lab right here in Toronto. That's where we'll start.
Okay, that sounds great, Kasia. Take it away.
Thanks, Cheryl. I'm Kasia Mihailovich, and this is The Decibel from the Globe and Mail.
I was just really fascinated by the idea that we have these drugs, they seem to do a fair amount of amazing things, but despite all that, we just still didn't have a great grasp of exactly how they did all the things they did.
That's Kelly Grant. She's a veteran health reporter and has done a lot of the reporting that's gone into this project.
So I've been covering health for the Globe for 10 years now, a little over 10 years actually, and I really love it.
To understand the science behind GLP-1s, Kelly went straight to the source.
I was fascinated by the guy who helped develop these decades ago, still wanting to work to unravel the mystery of how these drugs actually work inside the human body.
And the guy she's talking about is Dr. Daniel Drucker. He's an endocrinologist, which is a doctor who specializes in hormones. He's also a pioneer in GLP-1 research, and we went to his lab at Mount Sinai Hospital in Toronto. It looks like what you think, with the crowded workbenches and the glass beakers and all this equipment and scientists in lab coats. We're in Dr. Drucker's office when he goes into a cupboard and brings out a bottle of tequila named after a poisonous lizard.
So this is Gila tequila. So the first GLP-1 medicine came from the lizard venom. So I did not discover the lizard venom. The credit goes to John Ng, who is a biochemist who worked at the Bronx VA Hospital in New York.
Drucker then tells us a very condensed history of how drugs like Ozempic were first developed. He'd been studying GLP-1s since the mid-1980s, before Dr. Ng discovered that the Gila monster's venom made something called exendin-4, a molecule similar to the gut hormone GLP-1 that we make in our bodies.
And he was just randomly looking for new bioactive substances in the lizard venom, because when reptiles bite you, things happen, right? So you can either die because they inject an anticoagulant into you. If it's a frog and they kiss you, you'll turn into a princess. So people have looked for medicines in snake venom and reptile venom and frog secretions. And so he found this protein that looked sort of 50% like GLP-1. And he said, oh, this is really cool. I wonder if I could, use this to treat type 2 diabetes because it seemed to be a little more resistant to breakdown than GLP-1.
And Drucker says Dr. Eng could not stop talking about this.
He would go around to everyone saying, I've discovered a protein from the venom of a poisonous lizard. When this lizard bites you, you become extremely sick and you might even die. But one of the proteins in that venom, I think might be really cool to treat type 2 diabetes. So he patented that. The Bronx VA where he worked did not want to help him patent it because he thought he was a crazy person. So they just dismissed him out of hand.
But Drucker also became, I think it's fair to say, obsessed with the lizard venom. He wanted to study it, and in order to do that,
I had to get a lizard and clone the genes. I still have the lizard in the freezer, actually. Now she's excited.
It's true. Kelly and I both lit up.
I could not part with the lizard. I still have this lizard from 1990.
Sadly, only our photographer Sammy Kogan got to see it. And he said it was maybe a little bit freezer burned.
And it has these like orange bumps on the top. And you start to see that it really is just like a foot-long frozen lizard that's at least a couple decades old from what I'm hearing.
Yeah, that's a 20-year-old frozen lizard.
That's a 20-year-old frozen lizard and doesn't look a day younger.
Actually, it's more like 36 years old. But anyway, Dr. Drucker clones some of that Gila monster's genes to better understand what this GLP-1-like thing exendin 4 is. And that work, after many, many years, paid off. Drucker's cloning research was licensed to a pharmaceutical company, and they made the first GLP-1 drug called exenatide. It was approved to treat type 2 diabetes by the American Food and Drug Administration in 2005.
That was one of the most exciting days of my life. Because something you work on in basic science has like a 1 in 10,000 chance of becoming a drug, despite the press releases and all the, hope and hype that we have.
But what did you see that other people didn't see?
You have to remember, like 25 years ago, none of us had ever heard of GLP-1. We didn't know what it would do. If you said, it stimulates insulin secretion, they would say, well, we already have pills that stimulate insulin secretion. We didn't know about the weight loss. We didn't really know about the potential. So no one cared for the first couple of decades.
And you cared why?
Because I started with the story in the 1980s, and I thought it was pretty cool, and we just kept plugging away.
And in the 40 or so years Drucker has been plugging away, he and other scientists have discovered new ways to use GLP-1s by understanding more about how they work in the body.
In some cases, we know that if you have type 2 diabetes, the medicines lower your blood sugar. If you are living with obesity, the medicines lower your body weight. And those actions in turn, over time, make you healthier and maybe make you less susceptible to heart disease, to liver disease, to kidney disease.
But losing weight and lowering blood sugar are only part of why Drucker thinks GLP-1 can improve our health. It also seems to help reduce other risk factors that contribute to health problems. For example,
GLP-1 lowers your blood pressure. We know that GLP-1 reduces heart attacks and strokes and neurodegenerative disease, and having high blood pressure is bad for all of those and is a risk factor. So that might be one additional benefit. GLP-1 seems to affect your coagulation system.
Coagulation means the way your blood clots.
GLP-1 seems to lower your circulating levels of blood fats.
And that can lower your cholesterol.
And, inflammation is another risk factor for these complications, and GLP-1 does lower inflammation in many settings. So there are all these risk factors that GLP-1 modifies, and we don't fully understand how GLP-1 does that. And so that's a big part of what we do. And then, there are receptors on all of these organs that GLP-1 seems to help.
These receptors are how GLP-1 medications get their full name, glucagon-like peptide-1 receptor agonists. On a cellular level, GLP-1 finds each receptor on each cell and basically tells it, be healthier.
And there are these receptors for GLP-1 in the kidney, in the heart, in the blood vessels, in the brain, many different places. And we think that there's a direct contribution.
All of this is exciting because it shows that GLP-1 medication helps people in a variety of ways, not just by losing weight, as many people have thought over the years.
So it's a combination of improving your metabolic health, reducing your risk factors for chronic disease, and directly talking to those cells in those tissues to make them healthier.
So, GLP-1s are communicating with different parts of the body. But how do GLP-1s make people lose weight? That, interestingly, is all in the brain, according to Dr. Drucker. And he knows that in part because of what he's seen in mice when they remove the GLP-1 action in their brains.
You took the GLP-1 receptors out of the mice's brains, and then that stopped the weight loss.
Yeah, we inactivate it.
Yeah, so you inactivate it, right? So does that mean that we are now, or you are now, certain that the activity that leads to weight loss is centered in the brain as opposed
100%.
to the brain and the gut? You think it's 100% in the brain?
It's always been
Always
100%.
in the brain? Because, you read a lot about how the, Ozempic stops stomach emptying or slows stomach emptying.
So it's a very common misconception, even in very smart scientists. I'll show you the paper that we just sent back.
Here, Dr. Drucker pulls up a paper about what GLP-1s do in the brain that was sent to other scientists to read before it's published. This is called peer review, and it's an important process for good scientific research. And once those scientists have reviewed the paper, then Dr. Drucker gets to respond.
And I try and be polite. I don't want to be like the nasty guy. A reviewer 3, remember, these are all experts in how GLP-1 works, okay? So here's the first comment reviewer 3 makes. You need to revise some statements for accuracy. For instance, authors say that GLP-1 effects on gastric emptying, the way our gut is emptied in motility, are central, but they're also peripheral mechanisms. And I politely say, thank you. There is no evidence that I'm aware of that GLP-1 controls emptying through peripheral mechanisms. None, okay? And so there's this misconception. So all of the GI side effects, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, constipation, slowing of gut motility, that's all through the brain. It's been shown, without doubt, if I knock out the receptors in the brain, I remove all of those actions.
Okay, so I guess the key thing for when I'm trying to explain this for a lay audience is, yes, semaglutide slows stomach emptying, but it's because it acts on the brain and the brain tells the stomach to slow down?
Correct.
And that when you inactivate the GLP-1 receptors in the brain, that goes away?
Correct.
Okay.
Drucker is also used to correcting another common misconception.
Do people wonder whether you are also like the Ozempic billionaire? Have you made money off of your contribution to these drugs?
No, people ask me that all the time. And all of the modern medicines today, the patents are held by the drug companies. I did clone some of the GLP-1 associated genes and license them. And don't get me wrong, so I have had an amazing career. I have made a lot of money through my work, but I have never made $1 in licensing revenue from the sale of any GLP-1 medicine. And some of my business-oriented friends are so disappointed in me. But you should not feel sorry for Daniel Drucker.
Daniel Drucker's lab and labs across the world are doing amazing work to understand how GLP-1s can help fight disease. But if we're honest, GLP-1's rise to fame comes from its ability to make people lose weight. After the break, we'll talk more about that. After our trip to Dr. Drucker's lab, Kelly and I sat down to talk more about GLP-1's most famous effect, weight loss. First of all, what can you tell me about how many people in Canada fall into the category of overweight and of obese, and how do we know that? We don't go around measuring everybody.
Well, we do actually go out and physically measure at least some people, or Statistics Canada does. There are a couple of different sources we have for our estimates of the rates of people who are overweight and obese in Canada. They both come from StatsCan. StatsCan does something called the Canadian Health Measures Survey, where they actually go out in these like tricked out tractor trailers that they've turned into kind of mobile clinics, and they travel around the country for 2-year periods, bringing volunteers in to test all kinds of different aspects of their health. And one of the things they test is their weight. They ask them to get on a scale, and they also, use a tape measure to take a look at their waist circumference, hip to waist ratio. Then there's also something that StatsCan has called the Canadian Community Health Survey, where they ask people to self-report their height and their weight as part of a series of questions about their health. So what did the last version of the Canadian Health Measures, the in-person survey, tell us? It told us that 68% of Canadians, an estimated 68%, were either overweight or obese, and that is up 8 percentage points from a period before the pandemic. Now, of course, that's 68. A good chunk of that is overweight as opposed to obese. The prevalence of obesity in the most recent round of collection was 33% for adults, and that's also up.
When did we first start classifying obesity as a disease?
Oh, gosh, none of these questions are going to have the straightforward, simple answer that I think you're hoping for. Not everybody considers obesity to be a chronic disease, but most major medical organizations do. So in Canada, the Canadian Medical Association, which represents physicians, declared obesity a chronic disease back in 2015. Most provincial medical societies like the Ontario Medical Association do the same thing, the World Health Organization.
And the disease is defined just by what your BMI is?
That used to be the crux of the definition. Now, there was some really interesting work done last year by a commission that was put together by the Lancet that wanted to try to move away from BMI and redefine how we think about obesity. They spent a couple of years looking at the research. They got endorsements for this position from all kinds of medical societies and patient groups around the globe. And where they landed was saying, we think that rather than looking at BMI, a better idea is to look at adiposity, how much excess fat a person has, right? Because this is what's thought to be the main contributor to many of the metabolic diseases that often are linked to obesity. And what this Lancet Commission said was, we would consider somebody to have the clinical condition of obesity if they have excess adiposity, so too much body fat, right? And at least one weight-related metabolic comorbidity. Then if you have excess adiposity, but none of these, diseases that are associated with higher weight, like, cardiovascular disease or diabetes, they would deem that preclinical obesity. So clinical obesity and preclinical obesity. So that's where the Lancet Commission landed on that question.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, you're right. Nothing is straightforward or totally simple about this. There's a lot of in between and a lot of nuance.
And I think that nuance is really important, especially when we're talking about people who are living in larger bodies. There's people I've spoken to who say, well, wait a minute, just because I'm in a larger body, I'm not sick. I don't feel as though I have a disease. So why would you categorize me as having the chronic disease of obesity? Now, that doesn't mean that it's going to stay that way forever, right? And that having excess fat may in the long term still lead to developing some of these metabolic illnesses. But in the moment, that's a real contentious debate for some people who are living in larger bodies. I know that sounds euphemistic too. There's real debates about a lot of the terminology in this space that we're going to be talking about.
The big question I have is why? Why are these numbers trending up? Why are more and more Canadians overweight or obese?
It is the subject of a lot of debate, but I think big picture, the obesity rates had been rising slowly over decades in Canada. And the expert consensus seems to be a combination of our food environment changing really substantially, people going from eating, 3 home-cooked meals a day to just a litany of ultra-processed junk food. And we're surrounded by it. It's everywhere. It is cheap. It's easy to get your hands on. It's delicious. It is addictive. It's hard to say no to. And our lifestyles have become much more sedentary. We're sitting in front of computers all day as opposed to being, outside and moving around. We're not sleeping as well. We spend too much time sitting on our screens. The world around us has changed in a way that's really conducive to making us gain weight.
Do you mind if I record this part? Just I'm going to look at the levels and see what you sound like on here.
Okay. Testing, 1, 2, 3, testing.
Stephen Glazer is a doctor who specializes in treating people with obesity. We spoke after hours at the Humber River Health Hospital, where he's the medical director of bariatrics. He proudly showed me the chairs, the bathrooms, and the medical equipment that accommodate the size of his patients before we sat down in his office, just like his patients do.
Often a patient will come and they'll start off, I ask them why they're here, and they'll say, I've tried so hard, and they start crying. Or they'll tell me, it didn't matter what I did. I tried this diet, I tried that diet, I've lost, but I gained, and then some. And they really are suffering. They really are suffering.
Dr. Glazer's clinic works with different treatments for obesity, like bariatric surgery, specialized programs that include lifestyle changes, and medications, which now includes GLP-1s.
I believe that what we're seeing is a greater attention towards obesity because of the options that we have to treat obesity. So if I look back, 10 years when I was young, first of all, there wasn't a recognition of obesity as a chronic disease. So I think that recognizing obesity as a chronic disease provides legitimacy for addressing it. But what could we do? We had so many medications. If you look at the history of pharmacology for obesity medications, so many of them were associated with very negative or very dangerous side effects, mostly cardiac, but others. And so we really didn't have a box from which we could choose to treat people living with obesity. You will agree that in the last several years, it's exploding. It just snowballed. And I really do believe that we are very much at the top of this big, big hill with the snowball right at the top, and we're pushing it and it's starting to roll. And, we are helping people in ways we never, ever dreamt of.
This was the easiest thing I've ever done. I call it my magic drug. Mm-hmm. It just made things so much easier.
That's Virginia McKinnon. Kelly spoke with her and other people using GLP-1s to hear about their experiences. Virginia's in her 70s and lives in Sault Ste. Marie. She felt like using the drug helped her lose weight when more traditional diets didn't.
It takes away the cravings and the constant fight that you have when you're with Weight Watchers to not have things that, when you're on Weight Watchers or any of those other programs, you constantly fight to say, oh yeah, it's great, it changes how you eat and all that, but you're still constantly fighting against it. With the Wegovy, you don't feel that constant fight. It sort of becomes a no-brainer.
Virginia has tried to lose weight for years, in part to help with the arthritis in her joints.
I was aware that there were going to be ongoing issues that could arise from my weight that I wanted to avoid if I could. My husband is a wheelchair user. He's quite disabled, and I wanted to be fit to be able to continue caring for him.
In 2024, she started on Ozempic and then switched to Wegovy and lost 90 pounds in a year. Virginia told Kelly she plans to maintain her weight by staying on GLP-1s. But that's not everybody's plan.
Another person I spoke to, a younger guy named Abdul, he was an example of somebody who has gone off the drug. He had a goal weight to achieve. He wanted to feel better physically and be in better shape. He lost about 30 pounds, felt like it worked well for him, and he was ready to go off of it. And so he stopped. And then I spoke to others, for whom the drug just didn't work. There was one woman I spoke with, Jill Hepburn, and she went on both Ozempic and Wegovy and just found they didn't make any difference to her appetite. And she wanted to share with me that, these drugs aren't miracles that work for absolutely everyone, and how hard it was to see them working so well for other people and finding they didn't work for her. And she actually had a couple of people in her close circle who'd also gone on Ozempic and hadn't lost any weight. Now, that's why there are so many drug companies that are out there searching for and doing clinical trials around different versions of these drugs that target more hormones and that seem to produce greater degrees of weight loss. Think of Ozempic as very much a first, maybe second generation of these drugs, and there's many more generations to come.
An example of a slightly newer weight loss drug is tirzepatide, also known as Mounjaro or Zepbound. It's a GLP-1 similar to Ozempic.
The main difference is that tirzepatide targets two different hormone receptors, GLP-1 and another one that is abbreviated as GIP, G-I-P.
Okay. It's like a double whammy.
Yeah, you could put it that way.
That's probably scientifically what they say and why it works.
It's in all of the papers I read.
But even with the new variations of these medications hitting the market, like all medications, GLP-1s come with some risk. Dr. Glazer pointed out one in particular.
In any sort of weight loss experience, usually we see like 75% fat loss, 25% muscle loss. That's almost, a universal observation. And loss of muscle mass leads to weakness, it leads to sarcopenia, it leads to fragility, and those sorts of things lead to fall, and falls in the elderly are catastrophic. Loss of function because of muscle weakness. These are quality of life issues. And that's why with my patients, every single patient for whom I prescribe any of these weight loss medications, it always involves a conversation about physical activity and resistance training and, healthy choices, et cetera, et cetera. So muscle loss is a big deal. And the more we can preserve that through weight loss, the better the future is for these people.
Then there's the common gastric side effects. Here's Kelly.
Nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, constipation. You hear a lot about the constipation.
Sulfur burps, I think I've seen on the internet.
Yeah. So these they're quite common. And for many people, they lead them to say, I don't want to stay on these drugs. It's just they're too difficult to take.
But going off the drugs has its own potential consequence.
There was a recent meta-analysis, a study of studies that came out in the BMJ that suggested that people regain weight even faster when they come off these drugs than they do when they stop a run-of-the-mill diet. So I think we do have to think about what the implications are of patients starting these drugs and perhaps having to stay on them for the rest of their lives. Now, as I had many obesity doctors say to me while I was reporting out these stories, there are lots of drugs for chronic diseases that people stay on for decades or for their entire lives. If you need blood pressure medication, you stay on your blood pressure medication.
They're treatments, they're not cures.
Exactly.
And why is it bad to lose a bunch of weight and then gain it back?
Well, you go back to the old yo-yo dieting thing, right? Like, it just seems to be bad for your metabolism to have your weight go up and down and up and down. And then it becomes even harder to keep weight off as you get deeper into that process. And there are a couple of different theories about why people stop using these drugs. One is the side effects that I mentioned earlier. Another is that, like other medications for chronic diseases, the adherence rates are often not great. When somebody is expected to take a drug for kind of ever, and it isn't for an immediate sickness that you're feeling, it's not an antibiotic because you've got strep throat, or it isn't chemo for your life-threatening cancer, those kinds of drugs don't have great adherence rates as a general rule. And then the other reason I hear most commonly as a theory for why people stop these drugs is the cost.
The cost. It's something we don't always have to think about here in Canada thanks to public health care. But when it comes to weight loss, GLP-1 medications do have a price tag. How much you pay depends on your health insurance, your medication's brand, the dose you take, who you buy it from, and as of this year, how many companies start making generic versions of semaglutide, also known as Ozempic and Wegovy. In the next episode of Skinny Inc., we'll get into the big business of GLP-1s. Thank you for listening. I'm Kasia Mihailovich. This episode was produced by me and Allie Graham. Sound design and mixing by Allie Graham. The Decibel's senior producer is Adrian Chung, and our managing editor is Angela Pacenza. We'll be back next Monday with the second episode of Skinny Inc. on the Decibel.